Subscribe to Infidelity Tales Lab. Now, let's begin. Bradford Bass learned patience in the oil fields of West Texas, where he'd worked 70-hour weeks to put himself through night school. 20 years later, he'd built a logistics consulting firm from scratch, employing 43 people across 3 states. He wasn't old money like his wife's family, the Rhodes clan, who'd made their fortune in real estate and banking 3 generations back, but he'd earned every dollar through calculation and grit. His son Tommy, 8 years old with his mother's dark eyes and his father's quiet determination, had developed a stutter around his 6th birthday. The speech therapist said it was developmental, that most kids grew out of it. Bradford didn't care if Tommy stuttered his whole life. The kid had a mind like a steel trap and a heart bigger than anyone Bradford had ever known. Bradford's wife Krista understood this. She'd fallen in love with him precisely because he was nothing like the country club parasites she'd grown up around. But her father, Rhett Rhodes, had never forgiven her for marrying beneath their station, and he'd made the past decade a masterclass in subtle cruelty. Bradford kept a file, not a physical one. He wasn't stupid, but a mental catalog of every slight, every condescending comment, every time Rhett had made Krista doubt herself or made Tommy feel small. He'd never planned to use it. He convinced himself that being the bigger man meant letting Rhett's poison roll off his back. That was before the dinner. The invitation had come from Viola Rhodes, Krista's mother, for what she called a simple family gathering. Simple for the Rhodes family meant a catered affair at their estate in River Oaks, with 3 courses and wine that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Bradford's brother-in-law Edmund would be there with his wife Carolina, both of them carbon copies of Rhett's particular brand of smug superiority. Bradford had almost declined. His instincts, honed from years of reading people and situations, had been screaming warnings all week. But Krista had been excited. Her mother rarely made efforts to include them anymore, and Tommy had been practicing a joke he wanted to tell his grandfather. They arrived at 7. The Rhodes estate sprawled across 2 acres, a monument to excess that Rhett never tired of showing off. Bradford had worn his best suit, the charcoal Tom Ford that Krista had bought him for their anniversary. Tommy wore a clip-on tie and had gelled his hair, looking so earnest and hopeful that Bradford's chest had tightened. "Remember," Krista whispered as they walked to the door, squeezing Bradford's hand, "just a few hours." Viola greeted them with air kisses and immediately whisked Krista away to admire some new artwork. Edmund clapped Bradford on the shoulder with the forced bonhomie of someone who'd been told to be nice. Carolina smiled her reptilian smile and complimented Tommy's tie while looking right through him. Rhett held court in the study, a crystal tumbler of bourbon in his hand, regaling Patrick Mathis, a city councilman and longtime family friend, with some story about his latest real estate acquisition. He was 72, but looked 60, maintained by expensive personal trainers and the kind of medical care that kept rich men ambulatory well into their dotage. Silver-haired, square-jawed, with the kind of commanding presence that came from never being told no. He glanced at Bradford with the expression one might give a stain on expensive upholstery. "Bradford, you're here." "Rhett." Bradford didn't extend his hand. They'd stopped pretending years ago. "Grandpa." Tommy rushed forward, his face lit with excitement. "I learned a J joke. Want to hear it?" Something flickered across Rhett's face. Disgust, maybe, or embarrassment that Patrick Mathis was witnessing his grandson's impediment. "Not now, Thomas. The adults are talking. But it's really funny." "Why did the—" "Thomas." Rhett's voice went sharp. "I said not now." Bradford felt his jaw tighten, but he placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Come on, buddy. Let's find your mom." Dinner was the usual performance. Viola had hired some new chef who'd studied in Lyon, and each course was announced like a coronation. The table could seat 16. Tonight there were only 8 of them, spread out like strangers at a bus stop. Bradford sat at the far end from Rhett, with Tommy between him and Krista. Edmund droned on about a case his law firm was handling, something about mineral rights and offshore accounts. Carolina contributed the occasional, "How fascinating," though her eyes never left her phone. Patrick Mathis played the role of appreciative audience member, asking the right questions at the right times. Krista tried to steer conversation toward Tommy's recent achievement. He'd placed second in his school's math competition. The teacher said his spatial reasoning is remarkable for his age, she said, pride evident in her voice. That's wonderful, dear, Viola said, though she was already looking at Edmund. Speaking of achievements, Edmund, tell everyone about the partnership track. Tommy had been quiet through most of dinner, pushing his duck confit around his plate. Bradford had noticed him rehearsing something under his breath, his lips moving silently. The joke, probably. The kid had been so excited about it in the car. As dessert was served, some deconstructed tiramisu that looked like it had been sneezed onto the plate. Tommy cleared his throat. Bradford saw it coming and felt his stomach drop. "Grandpa," Tommy said, his voice carrying across the table. "I want to tell you that joke now." The table went quiet. Rhett looked up from his dessert, his expression already sour. "Tommy," Krista said softly, "maybe later." "No, it's okay, Mom." Tommy sat up straighter, so earnest, so brave. Why did the Scarecrow win an A award? The silence stretched. Bradford watched Rhett's face, saw the muscle in his jaw working. Patrick Mathis looked uncomfortable. Edmund smirked in his wine glass. "Tommy, we don't need to," Bradford started. Because he was outstanding in his F field. Tommy finished, his face breaking into a huge smile. Bradford felt his own lips twitch despite the tension. It was a stupid dad joke, the kind Tommy loved, and his delivery, even with the stutter, had been perfect. He opened his mouth to laugh, to encourage his son. Rhett's voice cut through the room like a knife. "Oh, for God's sake." Everyone froze. The child can barely string a sentence together. Rhett continued, setting down his fork with a sharp clink. "It's embarrassing, Krista. Have you even taken him to a specialist?" "Dad," Krista's voice was strained. "He has a speech therapist," Bradford said quietly, carefully. "It's completely normal." "Normal?" Rhett snorted. "The boy's 8 years old and sounds like a broken record. How's he supposed to amount to anything when he can't even tell a simple joke without?" "Rhett," Viola said weakly, but she didn't meet anyone's eyes. Tommy's smile had vanished. His face was turning red, his eyes welling with tears. Bradford reached for him, but the boy had gone rigid in his chair. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Rhett continued, warming to his topic now. He'd had too much bourbon, Bradford realized, enough to loosen whatever minimal filter he usually maintained. The Rhodes family has a reputation. Standards. And this, he gestured vaguely at Tommy. "This is not acceptable. That's enough." Bradford's voice was low, controlled, but there was steel underneath. Everyone at the table knew that tone. Even Edmund stopped smirking. "I'm not finished," Rhett said, his eyes locked on Bradford now. This was what he'd wanted all along, Bradford realized. Not to hurt Tommy. That was just collateral damage. This was about putting Bradford in his place, reminding him that he was the outsider, the one who didn't belong. Rhett turned his attention back to Tommy, who was now openly crying, silent tears streaming down his face. "Look at me when I'm talking about you, Thomas." Bradford moved without thinking, his chair scraping back. Krista grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in hard. "Bradford, don't. Please." He stopped, but only because Tommy was watching him, those big dark eyes pleading. "Don't make it worse," they said. "Don't give Grandpa another reason to be angry." Bradford sat back down slowly. He pulled Tommy close, felt the boy's small body shaking. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered. "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. And as Bradford looked across the table at Rhett Rhodes, at the satisfied smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, at the way he'd already turned back to his dessert as if Tommy was beneath notice, something cold and calculating clicked into place in Bradford's mind. The file he'd been keeping, the mental catalog of slights and cruelties, it had just become operational. Because Bradford Base had learned patience in those oil fields, yes. But he'd also learned that some men only understood one language, and it wasn't civility. He'd spent 10 years being the bigger man, being diplomatic, swallowing his pride for Krista's sake, for family harmony, for all the reasons that reasonable people compromised. But there was nothing reasonable about making an 8-year-old boy cry for sport, about humiliating a child to settle scores with the child's father. Rhett Rhodes wanted a war? He got in one. Bradford just smiled, helped Tommy wipe his tears, and made small talk through the rest of dessert. Because the first rule of strategy, the first thing he'd learned building his business from nothing, was that you never, ever showed your hand until you were ready to play it. And Bradford Base was very good at patience. The drive home was silent, except for Tommy's occasional sniffles from the back seat. Krista's knuckles were white on her purse strap, her jaw set. She'd barely spoken to her father for the rest of the evening, had declined coffee and dessert wine with clipped, frigid politeness. Bradford caught her eye in the rearview mirror and saw something he recognized. The same cold fury he was feeling, just manifesting differently. Krista had spent her whole life trying to earn Rhett's approval, trying to be the perfect daughter. And in 30 seconds, her father had reminded her exactly why that was a fool's errand. They got Tommy ready for bed together, both of them moving through the routine with mechanical precision. Bradford read 3 chapters of Percy Jackson while Tommy curled against him. And by the time the boy's breathing evened out into sleep, some of the tension had eased from his small frame. Krista was waiting in their bedroom, still in her dress, staring out the window at the Houston skyline. Their townhouse in Montrose was nice. Bradford had bought it outright 5 years ago, but it didn't have a view like the Rhodes estate. Then again, it also didn't have Rhett Rhodes, which made it infinitely more valuable. "I'm done," Krista said quietly. "I'm done making excuses for him. I'm done pretending he's going to change, or that family means anything to him beyond appearances." Bradford came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "I know. He made our son cry. Bradford. He humiliated Tommy in front of everyone. And for what? To prove some point? To remind you that you'll never be good enough." Her voice cracked. "What kind of grandfather does that?" "The kind who's about to learn a very important lesson," Bradford said softly. Krista turned in his arms, searching his face. She knew him well enough to recognize that tone, that particular quality of calm that meant he'd already moved from reaction to strategy. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." It was only partially true. The shape of it was there, crystallizing in his mind. "But I need you to trust me, Krista. Can you do that?" She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "My father is very powerful, Bradford. He has connections, money, lawyers. I know what he has." Bradford kissed her forehead. "And I know what he doesn't have." "What's that?" "A conscience. And that's going to make this so much easier." Krista didn't ask him to elaborate, which was one of the many reasons he loved her. She understood that some plans needed time to develop, that sometimes the best thing you could do was let a smart man work. After she'd fallen asleep, Bradford went down to his home office and opened his laptop. He didn't start with Rhett Rhodes. That would come later. First, he needed to understand the full architecture of the man's life. His businesses, his relationships, his dependencies, his weaknesses. Rhett sat on the boards of 3 major corporations and 2 charitable foundations. He owned commercial real estate across Houston and Austin, had a stake in a private equity firm, and maintained the kind of political connections that came from generations of strategic donations. On paper, he was untouchable. But Bradford had built his career on finding efficiencies, on seeing the connections that others missed. Every system had vulnerabilities. Every structure had load-bearing elements that, if removed, would cause the whole thing to collapse. He just needed to find Rhett's. Bradford pulled up his personal network. People he'd worked with, people who owed him favors, people who had access to information. He started making a list, checking it against Rhett's known associates and business interests. There were overlaps, points of intersection where Bradford could insert himself without raising alarms. His phone buzzed. A text from Lionel Mahoney, his oldest friend and the closest thing to a brother Bradford had. They'd worked those oil fields together, had scraped through college together, had stood up at each other's weddings. Krista told Maria what happened. "You okay?" Bradford smiled grimly and typed back. "Will be. Need to talk tomorrow." Discreetly. "My office. 8 a.m. Bring coffee." Lionel ran a private investigation firm now, specializing in corporate due diligence. If anyone could help Bradford map the territory, it was him. Bradford worked until 3 in the morning, building the skeleton of his plan. He knew it wasn't enough yet. This would take time, precision, and resources. But the foundation was there, and with each connection he traced, each vulnerability he identified, the shape of Rhett Rhodes's downfall became clearer. The man had made a career out of crushing people he considered beneath him. He'd never faced real consequences because he'd never encountered anyone willing to push back hard enough, smart enough, patient enough. Bradford shut his laptop as the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows. Tommy would be up in a few hours, would probably have nightmares about last night for weeks. But eventually, when this was over, Bradford would tell him the truth, that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage you could have, and that men like Rhett Rhodes only seemed invincible until someone finally called their bluff. Lionel's office occupied the third floor of a converted warehouse in the East End, all exposed brick and industrial lighting. His firm handled everything from background checks to full forensic investigations, and he built a reputation for thoroughness that made him very expensive and very worth it. He had 2 cups of coffee waiting when Bradford arrived at 8 sharp, both black, both from the Cuban place on the corner that Lionel swore by. He took one look at Bradford's face and whistled low. That bad. Worse. Bradford sat down and laid out what had happened at dinner, not embellishing, just stating facts. Lionel's expression darkened as the story unfolded. That miserable son of a... Lionel cut himself off, shaking his head. I never liked that pompous ass, but this is low even for him. Tommy okay? Physically, yes. Emotionally? Bradford shrugged. He's a tough kid, but he's 8. He shouldn't have to be tough about his own grandfather. So what are you thinking? Bradford pulled out his phone and showed Lionel the preliminary work he'd done, the network map he'd started building. Lionel studied it, his expression shifting from anger to interest to something like admiration. You want to dismantle him piece by piece. I want to make sure he feels every inch of the fall, Bradford corrected. And I want him to know exactly why it's happening. This isn't about anonymous revenge. This is about showing Rhett Rhodes that he picked the wrong family to terrorize. Lionel leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. You know this is going to get messy. A man like Rhett doesn't go down quietly. I'm counting on it. And you're okay with whatever collateral damage might come with it? Because this won't just hurt him. It's going to hurt Viola, maybe Edmund, maybe even people who just happen to be in a blast radius. Bradford had already considered this. Viola watched it happen and said nothing. Edmund laughed. The people in his orbit have enabled him for decades. If they go down with him, that's a choice they made. Cool. But Lionel was nodding appreciatively. All right. What do you need from me? Everything. Financial records, business dealings, personal dirt. I want to know everywhere Rhett Rhodes is vulnerable. I want to know who he's screwed over, who's carrying grudges, who might be willing to help if the right opportunity presented itself. That's going to take time. I know. I'm not looking for quick. I'm looking for total. Lionel pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. Okay, I'll start with public records, corporate filings, that kind of thing. But if you want the real dirt, I'll need to reach out to some contacts. People who've crossed paths with him, maybe gotten burned. Do it. I'll cover whatever it costs. I'm not worried about money, Brad. I'm worried about you. Lionel set down his pen and looked Bradford in the eye. This kind of thing changes people. You sure you want to go down this road? Bradford thought about Tommy's face at that dinner table, about the way his son's smile had crumbled, about the tears. He thought about 10 years of subtle cuts and dismissals, of watching Krista tie herself in knots trying to be good enough for a father who would never see her as anything but a disappointing daughter. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Then let's burn his world down. They spent the next 3 hours going through everything Bradford had compiled. Lionel had insights that Bradford had missed. Connections between Rhett's business partners, rumors about deals that had gone sideways, whispers about the kind of corner cutting that was legal but ethically dubious. He's on the board of Memorial Children's Hospital, Lionel noted, tapping one of the entries. Big charity presence, lots of photo ops. But I heard from a friend who works development there that Rhett's been pushing to cut funding for the speech therapy program. Bradford went very still. Say that again. The speech therapy program. Apparently, it's not prestigious enough for him. He wants the money redirected to something that gets the Rhodes name on a building. Lionel looked up, saw Bradford's expression. Oh, Oh damn. Tommy goes to speech therapy twice a week, Bradford said softly. It's helped him immensely. And Rhett wants to cut funding for other kids like Tommy because it's not glamorous enough. That's not just cruel, that's systematic. Bradford felt the last piece of hesitation dissolve. He'd been prepared to destroy Rhett Rhodes for humiliating his son. Now he had confirmation that Rhett's cruelty extended far beyond one family dinner. This wasn't a grandfather having a bad night. This was a pattern of behavior, a fundamental contempt for anyone he deemed weak or imperfect. Lionel was already typing on his laptop. I'm going to dig into the hospital board meetings, see if there's documentation of this. If he's been vocal about it, there might be minutes, emails. Do it. And Lionel, I need you to find me everyone Rhett has stepped on to get where he is. Every business he crushed, every partner he cheated, every person who walked away from dealings with him carrying a grudge. That's going to be a long list. Good, because I'm building an army. Over the next 2 weeks, Bradford operated on 2 parallel tracks. Publicly, he was the same dutiful son-in-law, taking Krista and Tommy to Sunday brunch at the club, making small talk at Edmund's birthday dinner, playing the role of the man who knew his place. He watched Rhett hold court, accepting congratulations on his latest real estate coup, a downtown development that had somehow gotten fast-track approval despite neighborhood opposition. Privately, Bradford was assembling a picture of Rhett Rhodes that would have made the man's society friends very uncomfortable. Lionel came through with everything Bradford had asked for and more. Rhett had a history of squeezing out minority partners in real estate deals, using legal fine print to maximize his share and minimize theirs. He'd foreclosed on properties owned by families going through medical bankruptcies, had bought the debt at pennies on the dollar, and then evicted them with clinical efficiency. The Memorial Children's Hospital revelation was even worse than they'd initially thought. Rhett wasn't just proposing cuts to speech therapy. He'd been actively campaigning against the entire developmental services wing, calling it a waste of donor capital on lost causes. Bradford read that phrase 3 times, felt it burn into his memory. Lost causes. That's what Rhett called children like Tommy. But the real gold mine came from an unexpected source. One of Lionel's investigators had tracked down a woman named Margie Meyer, who'd worked as Rhett's executive assistant for 15 years before being abruptly fired 3 years ago. She'd signed an NDA, had taken a generous severance package, and had kept her mouth shut. Until Bradford showed up at her door. Margie lived in a modest bungalow in the Heights, a far cry from the River Oaks mansion she'd helped manage for a decade and a half. She was 63, sharp-eyed, and the moment Bradford introduced himself, "I'm married to Krista Rhodes," her expression shifted from suspicious to intrigued. "You're the logistics consultant," she said, gesturing him into her living room. "Krista married you instead of that awful Hammond boy Rhett had picked out. I always liked her for that." Bradford sat on the offered couch, accepted the tea she poured, and waited. "Patience. I assume you're here because Rhett did something," Margie said, settling into her chair. "He's good at that. He humiliated my 8-year-old son at a family dinner. Made him cry because he has a stutter." Margie's face hardened. "Of course he did. That sounds exactly like him. Mrs. Meyer, I'll be direct. I'm building a case against Rhett Rhodes, and I think you have information that could help me. But I also know you signed an NDA, and I'm not asking you to violate it without protection. An NDA that means nothing if I'm telling the truth in a legal proceeding," Margie said. "And before you ask, yes, I've been waiting for someone to come asking. 3 years is a long time to sit on what I know." Over the next 2 hours, Margie Meyer gave Bradford a masterclass in Rhett Rhodes' corruption. Tax evasion schemes that his accountants had been too scared to report. Bribes to city officials disguised as campaign contributions. A pattern of harassment toward female employees that HR had been instructed to bury. And, most damningly, evidence that Rhett had been systematically inflating property values in his portfolio using shell companies and fraudulent appraisals. "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" Bradford asked. "Because I'm 63 years old and I needed my severance to survive," Margie said bluntly. "Because Rhett Rhodes has friends in the DA's office and half the judges in this city owe him favors. Because I knew that if I came forward alone, he'd crush me and nothing would stick to him. And now I'm 3 years away from Social Security, and I've got enough saved to weather whatever storm comes. And you, she pointed at Bradford, you look like a man who's actually capable of taking him down. So yes, I'll help you. On one condition. Name it. When this goes public, when Rhett's empire starts crumbling, I want my name attached to it. I want everyone to know that Margie Meyer helped bring down the great Rhett Rhodes. I've spent 3 years feeling like a coward. I'm done with that. Bradford extended his hand. Deal. They shook on it, and Bradford left with 3 file boxes worth of documentation that Margie had been keeping in her storage unit. Tax documents, emails, recorded phone calls. She'd been preparing for this moment. She just hadn't known when it would come. One more thing. Margie called as Bradford loaded the boxes into his car. The city councilman, Patrick Mathis. He and Rhett have a deal going on that downtown development. Mathis fast-tracked the permits in exchange for a silent partnership stake. If you want to hit Rhett where it really hurts, you start by taking away his political cover. Bradford felt a slow smile spread across his face. Patrick Mathis had been at that dinner, had sat there while Rhett humiliated Tommy, had said nothing. He'd chosen his side. Thank you, Mrs. Meyer, for everything. Don't thank me yet. Just make sure you finish what you're starting. Rhett Rhodes is like a wounded animal when he's cornered. He's going to lash out. You need to be ready for that. Bradford drove home with Margie's words echoing in his mind. He knew she was right. This wasn't going to be clean or easy. Rhett would fight back, would use every weapon in his considerable arsenal. But Bradford had something Rhett didn't, a righteous fury built on protecting his family, not his pride. And he had patience. Rhett was used to people who could be intimidated, bought off, or outlasted. He'd never faced someone who was willing to play the long game, to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. That night, Bradford called a meeting in his home office. Him, Lionel, and Krista. He laid out everything he'd learned, holding nothing back. Krista's face went pale as she read through Margie's documentation, saw the extent of her father's corruption. This could destroy him, she whispered. That's the idea, Lionel said. But it could also destroy the family. Mom, Edmund, Carolina, they're all tied up in his businesses, his reputation. If this comes out, then they'll have to answer for their complicity, Bradford said gently. Krista, your mother watched him humiliate Tommy and said nothing. Edmund laughed. They're adults who made choices. Krista looked at him, her eyes wet. I know. He's still my father. And Tommy is your son. Our son. And somewhere in the city, there are other kids like Tommy who won't get the therapy they need because your father thinks they're lost causes. Bradford took her hand. I need you to decide, right now, if you're with me on this. Because once I start, I'm not stopping. But I won't do it if it means losing you. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across the desk. Then she squeezed his hand hard and looked up at him with steel in her eyes. The same steel that had made her rebel against Rhett's expectations and marry Bradford in the first place. I'm with you. All the way. Then we move forward, Bradford said. He looked at Lionel. How fast can you give me a meeting with someone at the IRS? Lionel grinned. What does next Tuesday sound? Perfect. Because I want to make sure that when Friday night comes, when Rhett Rhodes gets home for whatever golf game or board meeting he's using to feel important, he's got so many problems piling up that his phone doesn't stop ringing. Krista managed a small smile. 43 missed calls? At minimum, Bradford confirmed. But we're going to make sure every single one of them is a nail in his coffin. The plan was coming together, piece by piece, and Bradford could see the end game now. Not just Rhett's downfall, but his complete and total exposure, stripped of his power, his reputation, his carefully constructed image of respectability. And it all started with one simple truth. The worst thing you could do to a man like Rhett Rhodes wasn't to destroy him quietly. It was to make sure everyone watched while it happened. The IRS meeting happened in a nondescript federal building on a Tuesday afternoon. Bradford sat across from Agent Solomon Conrad, a 20-year veteran of the Criminal Investigation Division who had the weary eyes of a man who'd seen every flavor of tax fraud humanity had to offer. Mr. Bass, I appreciate you coming forward with this information, Conrad said, leafing through the documents Margie had provided. But you understand that we get tips like this all the time. Most of them don't pan out. With respect, Agent Conrad, most people don't walk in with 15 years of documentation from a former executive assistant who handled the actual accounting. Bradford slid another folder across the desk. These are shell company formations that Rhett Rhodes used to move money offshore. The companies all trace back to him through family trusts and silent partnerships, but the paper trail is deliberately obscure. Conrad's expression shifted from skeptical to interested. How did you obtain these documents? Legally, from someone who maintained them as part of her job responsibilities and kept copies when she left the company. She's willing to testify, provide sworn statements, whatever you need. And her motivation? Justice. Same as mine. Bradford met Conrad's eyes steadily. Rhett Rhodes has spent 30 years gaming the system. He bribes officials, manipulates markets, and uses the law as a weapon against anyone who challenges him. But he got sloppy with his taxes because he assumed his accountants would protect him and his connections would shield him. Conrad was silent for a moment, then picked up his phone. "Jenny, can you give me the Rhodes file?" "Yes, that Rhodes." He hung up and looked at Bradford. "We've actually been looking at Mr. Rhodes peripherally for about 18 months. Nothing concrete enough to move on, but enough smoke to make us curious. If what you're giving us is legitimate," "It is." "Then you might have just handed us the case we've been building." A paralegal brought in another file, thicker than Bradford expected. Conrad opened it, cross-referenced it with the documents Bradford had provided, and his expression grew progressively more satisfied. "Mr. Bass, I'm going to need you to leave these materials with us. I'm also going to need contact information for your source." Bradford handed over Margie Meyer's details. "She's expecting your call. One more thing. This investigation, when it goes active, is going to be quiet until we're ready to move. That could be months. Can you be patient?" Bradford thought about Tommy's face, about the 10 years of accumulated humiliation, about every child who wouldn't get therapy because Rhett Rhodes thought they were lost causes. "Agent Conrad, I've been patient my entire life. What's a few more months?" But Bradford wasn't just waiting. While the IRS built their case, he was constructing the rest of Rhett's downfall with the precision of a master strategist. Patrick Mathis, the city councilman, was the next piece. Bradford arranged a meeting through mutual business contacts, positioned as a potential consulting opportunity for the city's infrastructure projects. They met at a downtown restaurant, all smiles and professional courtesy. "I've heard excellent things about your logistics work," Mathis said, shaking Bradford's hand. "The city could use more efficiency in our contracting processes." "I appreciate that, Councilman. Though I have to admit, I had an ulterior motive for this meeting." Bradford kept his tone light, friendly. "I'm actually interested in learning more about the downtown development project. The one Rhett Rhodes is heading up." Mathis's smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind his eyes. "That's more of a private sector initiative, though of course the city facilitated the permits. Facilitated unusually fast from what I understand. Neighborhood opposition disappeared almost overnight." "Mr. Bass, I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, Councilman. I'm stating facts. You fast-tracked permits for a development that benefited Rhett Rhodes, and in return, you received a silent partnership stake worth roughly $2.3 million. Bradford pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table. "This is the shell company that holds your stake. Interesting how it was formed 3 days after the permits were approved." Mathis went pale. "How did you?" "The same way the FBI is going to find out when I hand this over to them. Unless, of course, you'd like to avoid that particular headache." "What do you want?" "I want you to understand that Rhett Rhodes is going down. The only question is how many people he takes with him. You could be collateral damage, or you could be a cooperating witness who made a mistake and corrected it." Mathis's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his water glass. "I have a family, a career. If this comes out, then you should have thought about that before you took a bribe." Bradford's voice was cold now, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Here's how this works, Councilman. You're going to start documenting every interaction you've had with Rhett Rhodes regarding city business. Every favor, every shortcut, every bent rule. You're going to provide that documentation to the appropriate authorities, and you're going to make it very clear that this was Rhett's idea, his pressure, his corruption. He'll destroy me. He's going to be too busy trying to save himself. And if you cooperate fully, if you give prosecutors what they need, you might walk away with your career intact. Maybe even spin it as a redemption story. The public servant who found his conscience and exposed corruption. Mathis stared at the document in front of him for a long moment. And if I don't cooperate with you, then I go to the FBI today instead of giving you a week to make the right choice. And I make sure every reporter in Houston knows that you sat at a dinner table and laughed while a grown man mocked an 8-year-old child with a speech impediment. You think your constituents will be understanding about that? The councilman's face crumbled. I didn't think. No, you didn't. You spent so long doing Rhett's bidding that you forgot what it means to be a decent human being. So here's your chance to remember. Bradford stood up, dropped 2 20s on the table for his untouched lunch. 1 week, Councilman Mathis. Make it count. He left Mathis sitting there, looking 10 years older than he had when they'd sat down. The dominoes were falling, but Bradford wasn't done yet. Through Lionel's network, he'd identified 5 other business partners who had been squeezed out of deals by Rhett over the years, each of them nursing grievances but afraid to act. Bradford reached out to them one by one, not asking them to do anything illegal, just to be ready to speak truth when the time came. One of them was Delbert Bridges, who'd been partners with Rhett in a commercial development in the early 2000s. Rhett had used a technicality to force Bridges out just before the property value soared, costing Bridges roughly $8 million in potential profit. I wanted to sue, Bridges told Bradford over coffee. My lawyers said we'd probably win. But Rhett threatened to drag it out for years, bleed me dry with legal fees. He knew I couldn't afford to fight him. What if you didn't have to fight alone? Bridges looked up sharply. What are you saying? I'm saying that Rhett Rhodes is about to face consequences for the first time in his life. And when that happens, there's going to be a window where all his former partners, all the people he's cheated, are going to have their chance to speak up. The question is whether you'll be ready. I've been ready for 20 years. Good. Because I'm not looking for revenge, Mr. Bridges. I'm looking for justice. And that means making sure everyone knows exactly who Rhett Rhodes really is. Similar conversations played out over the following weeks. Bradford didn't promise anyone money or favorable outcomes. He simply lit a fire under people who'd been carrying grudges for years, showed them that Rhett wasn't untouchable, that the empire was built on sand. At home, Bradford maintained perfect normalcy. He took Tommy to Little League practice, helped with homework, read bedtime stories. The boy was slowly recovering from the dinner incident, though he'd become quieter around family events. Krista had stopped pushing for them to attend Rhodes' family functions, had started making excuses about scheduling conflicts. Viola called occasionally, her voice carrying the brutal quality of someone pretending everything was fine. Rhett never called. Bradford suspected the old man thought he'd won, that he'd successfully put Bradford back in his place. Let him think that. 2 months after the dinner, Bradford got the call from Agent Conrad. We're ready to move. Early Friday morning, we'll be executing search warrants at Rhodes Properties headquarters in Rhett's home. I wanted to give you a heads up. I appreciate that, Agent Conrad. Mr. Bass, Brad, I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of people come through my office with grudges against the wealthy. Most of them just want to see someone punished. But you've given us something different. You've handed us a legitimate criminal case with evidence that will hold up in court. Whatever Rhett Rhodes did to you, to your family, I want you to know that justice will be served. Thank you. That means more than you know. Bradford hung up and immediately called Lionel. It's happening. This Friday. FBI. IRS. But the FBI will probably join once they see what the initial search turns up. Mathis came through with documentation on the bribery, and that's going to pull in federal corruption charges. Jesus. You actually did it. Not yet. This is just the beginning. Friday is when Rhett's phone starts ringing, but we need to make sure it doesn't stop. What do you need? Contact every reporter you know. Major outlets, local news, financial press. Make sure they know something big is about to break with Rhett Rhodes. Don't give them details yet, just enough to have cameras ready when federal agents show up at his office. On it. Anything else? Bradford smiled grimly. Yeah, prepare Margie Meyer. She's about to become very famous. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, an unusual chill for Houston in spring. Bradford was up early, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise from his back patio. Krista found him there at 6, wrapped in his robe. "Can't sleep?" she asked, sliding into his lap. "Didn't want to. I've been waiting for this day for too long." "Are you sure about this?" "Once it starts." "It's already started, sweetheart. This is just the world catching up to what we already know." He kissed her forehead. "Your father is going to call you today. Probably multiple times. You need to decide how you want to handle that." "Already know. I'm not answering." She looked up at him, her eyes clear. "Whatever happens to him, he earned it. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make his life easier. He'll try to turn the family against us. Against me specifically. Let him try. Edmund can pick a side, Mom can pick a side. But I picked mine 10 years ago when I married you, and nothing that happens today changes that." At 7:15 a.m., federal agents arrived at Rhodes Properties headquarters with search warrants. By 7:30, they were at the River Oaks estate, much to Viola's horrified surprise. And by 8 a.m., Rhett Rhodes's phone was ringing off the hook. Lawyers, business partners, board members, all demanding to know what was happening. Bradford knew this because Lionel had someone watching the scene, feeding him real-time updates. The local news stations had picked up on the story, were broadcasting live footage of federal agents carrying boxes out of Rhodes Properties. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Developing. Federal investigation into prominent Houston developer." By noon, the story had grown. Patrick Mathis had held a press conference, confessing to his role in the permitting scandal and announcing his resignation from the city council. He'd positioned it exactly as Bradford had suggested, a public servant who'd made a mistake and was now cooperating fully with federal authorities. The reporters, smelling blood in the water, immediately connected Mathis's confession to the raid on Rhett Rhodes's properties. By 2 p.m., Rhett's name was trending on local Twitter. By 4 p.m., national financial news outlets were picking up the story. Bradford's phone rang at 5:30 p.m. Edmund Rhodes, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "What did you do?" "I don't know what you're talking about, Edmund. Don't play stupid with me. Federal agents raided my father's office today. The IRS, the FBI. Do you have any idea what this is doing to our family?" "I imagine it's pretty embarrassing," Bradford said calmly. "But embarrassment is temporary. Prison time, on the other hand. You son of a bitch. You did this. You orchestrated this whole thing because Dad hurt your feelings at a dinner." "He didn't hurt my feelings, Edmund. He made my 8-year-old son cry because he has a speech impediment. There's a difference. So you decided to destroy our entire family over it." "I decided that a man who spends his free time trying to cut funding for children's speech therapy programs while running illegal tax schemes probably deserved to face consequences. Your father's problems are his own making, Edmund. I just made sure the right people knew about them. Krista needs to hear what kind of man she married." Krista knows exactly what kind of man she married. She's the one who gave me Margie Meyer's contact information. The silence on the other end of the line was satisfying. "You're lying," Edmund finally said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Ask her yourself, if she takes your call." Bradford hung up. At 6:47 p.m., Bradford's monitoring software, a little program Lionel had set up to track public records updates, pinged with an alert. The IRS had filed formal charges against Rhett Rhodes: tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The FBI followed with their own charges related to the bribery scandal. Bradford opened a bottle of wine, poured 2 glasses, and handed one to Krista. They clinked glasses silently and drank while watching the evening news coverage of Rhett's arrest at his attorney's office, where he'd gone to surrender himself. The sight of Rhett Rhodes in handcuffs, being perp-walked past a dozen cameras, was something Bradford knew he'd remember for the rest of his life. Not because it brought him joy, it didn't, not exactly, but because it brought balance. Justice. Tommy came downstairs, drawn by the sound of the television. "Mom? Why is Grandpa on TV?" Krista pulled him close. "Because sometimes people who do bad things have to answer for them, sweetie. Even if they're family." "Did Grandpa do bad things?" "Yes," Bradford said. "He did. And now he's going to face consequences." Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "Is that because of what he said to me?" "At dinner." Bradford knelt down to his son's level. That was part of it. But mostly it's because your grandfather has been hurting people for a very long time, and someone needed to make sure he stopped. Was that someone you? Yes. Tommy thought about this, his young face serious. Then he hugged Bradford tight. Thank you, Daddy. Bradford held his son, feeling Krista's hand on his shoulder, and thought about all the dominoes that were still falling. Rhett's board positions would be forfeit. His business empire would crumble under federal seizure and civil lawsuits from former partners like Delbert Bridges, who'd already filed suit that afternoon. The Memorial Children's Hospital would quietly remove Rhett's name from their donor wall and cancel his board appointment. And through it all, Rhett Rhodes would know exactly who had orchestrated his downfall, because Bradford had made sure of it. The weekend brought a media circus. Reporters camped outside the Rhodes estate, documenting Viola's every movement as she consulted with lawyers and crisis management experts. Edmund held his own press conference, attempting to distance himself from his father's crimes. But the reporters weren't gentle. They'd done their homework, found connections between Edmund's law firm and some of Rhett's shell companies. By Monday morning, Edmund was being investigated by the Texas Bar Association for potential ethics violations. Bradford went to work as usual, fielding calls from clients who'd seen the news and wanted to make sure his company wasn't implicated. He assured them all that Rhodes' family business and base logistics were completely separate entities, which was true. Bradford had been meticulous about keeping his professional life clean. The call he'd been waiting for came Tuesday afternoon. Rhett Rhodes, calling from his attorney's office, his voice stripped of its usual command. Bradford, we need to talk. I don't think we do, Rhett. Please. The words sounded like it physically pained him. I'm asking for a conversation. Man to man. Bradford let the silence stretch, let Rhett feel what it was like to wait on someone else's pleasure for once. 20 minutes. Your attorney's office. And Rhett? Come alone. The law office was downtown, sleek glass and expensive furniture meant to project success and stability. Rhett looked like he'd aged a decade in 5 days. His silver hair, usually immaculately styled, was disheveled. His eyes were bloodshot, his expensive suit rumpled. Thank you for coming, Rhett said, standing as Bradford entered. Bradford didn't sit. You have 15 minutes. Talk. I know what you did. The IRS, the FBI, Mathis, it all leads back to you. Is that what your lawyers told you? It's what I know. Because I underestimated you, Bradford. I thought you were just some oil field trash who got lucky, who married above his station. I didn't realize you were smart enough to... He cut himself off, his jaw working. To what? Bring down the great Rhett Rhodes. Bradford's voice was cold. You brought yourself down, Rhett. Every crime, every bribe, every person you crushed to build your empire. That was all you. I just made sure people knew about it. I made a mistake at that dinner. I was drunk, You were yourself. The same man who's been making children cry and calling them lost causes for years. The same man who's built a fortune on corruption and cruelty. Bradford checked his watch. You have 10 minutes left. What do you want? Money? I can make this go away, make you rich. I am rich, Rhett. I built my company from nothing, and it's worth more than you think. I don't need your money, and I don't want it. Then what? What do you want from me? I want you to understand what you did. Not to me. I'm a grown man. I can handle your contempt. But to Tommy, to my son, an 8-year-old boy who loved his grandfather and just wanted to tell him a joke. Bradford's voice shook slightly. I want you to understand that you don't get to hurt children and walk away unscathed. Not my child. Not any child. Rhett's face crumpled. I'll apologize to him. To Tommy. I'll make it right. No. Bradford's voice was flat. You don't get to be near my son ever again. You don't get to be at birthdays or graduations or any moment in his life. You lost that privilege when you made him cry for your own amusement. Bradford, please. I'm 72 years old. If this goes to trial, if I'm convicted, I could die in prison. Then you should have thought about that before you spent 30 years breaking the law. Bradford turned to leave, then paused at the door. You know what the worst part is, Rhett? You could have been a good grandfather. You could have been someone Tommy looked up to, someone who made him feel proud and loved. Instead, you'll be the cautionary tale I tell him about how power without character leads to ruin. Wait. But Bradford was already walking out, leaving Rhett Rhodes alone with the consequences he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. The legal proceedings stretched on for months. Rhett's attorneys fought every charge, filed every motion, but the evidence was overwhelming. Agent Conrad had done his job well. The IRS case was airtight. The FBI corruption charges were equally solid, bolstered by Patrick Mathis's testimony and the documents Margie Meyer had provided. Delbert Bridges' civil suit opened the floodgates. Within weeks, 8 other former business partners had filed similar suits, each one claiming Rhett had defrauded them through various schemes. The cumulative effect was devastating. Rhodes' properties filed for bankruptcy protection. The family trusts were frozen pending the outcome of the criminal trial. Viola Rhodes filed for divorce after 38 years of marriage, claiming she'd been kept in the dark about Rhett's illegal activities. Whether that was true or just a strategic move to protect marital assets, Bradford didn't know and didn't care. Edmund Rhodes was disbarred pending the outcome of his own investigation. He, in Carolina, moved to Austin, trying to escape the Houston media spotlight. Edmund sent Krista a bitter email blaming her and Bradford for destroying the family. Krista deleted it without responding. Through it all, Bradford maintained his routine. Work, family, the occasional meeting with prosecutors who needed clarification on documents. He never showed up to court proceedings, never gave interviews to the press. This wasn't about glory or public vindication. This was about Tommy sleeping peacefully at night, without nightmares about his grandfather's cruelty. The trial began 8 months after that fateful dinner. Bradford didn't attend, but Krista did for one day, the day Margie Meyer testified. She came home that evening with tears in her eyes. Margie was incredible, she told Bradford. She laid out everything, every scheme, every crime. And when Rhett's attorney tried to make it seem like she was just a disgruntled employee, she looked right at Rhett and said, "I worked for you for 15 years because I needed the job. But I'm testifying against you today because it's the right thing to do." How did Rhett react? Like a man watching his world end. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When the verdict came back, guilty on all counts, Bradford was at Tommy's school, watching him participate in a reading competition. Tommy had been working with his speech therapist on public speaking, and his stutter had improved dramatically. Bradford's phone buzzed with a news alert, but he didn't check it until after Tommy had finished his presentation. His son had read 3 pages from his favorite book without a single stutter, had bowed to applause from the other students and teachers. Later that evening, with Tommy in bed and Krista beside him on the couch, Bradford finally let himself feel the full weight of what he'd accomplished. Rhett Rhodes, the untouchable patriarch, the man who'd terrorized his own family and countless business associates for decades, would be spending his final years in federal prison. "Do you feel better?" Krista asked quietly. "Now that it's over, I feel like justice was served," Bradford said carefully. "Whether that makes me feel better or not doesn't really matter. What matters is that Tommy is safe, that other kids will be safe, that men like Rhett understand there are consequences. My mother called today. She wants to see Tommy." "What did you tell her?" "That I needed to talk to you first." Krista looked at him. She stood by and watched Brad. She let him terrorize us for years and never said a word. "I know, and if you never want to see her again, I support that completely. But she's also your mother, and she's going to be alone now. That's your decision to make, not mine." Krista was quiet for a long moment. I think I need to see her once. To tell her exactly why I can't have her in Tommy's life right now. Maybe ever. She needs to understand that silence has consequences too. Then do what you need to do. I trust your judgment." 3 weeks later, Rhett Rhodes was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He was 72 years old. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, noted that while she took Rhett's age into consideration, the breadth and duration of his crimes demanded significant punishment. "You use your wealth and position to corrupt public officials, defraud the government, and enrich yourself at the expense of honest business people," the judge said. "Your actions undermine public trust and cause real harm to real people." The sentence must reflect that. Bradford watched the news coverage that evening with a glass of whiskey and a sense of quiet satisfaction. Not triumph. This wasn't about winning. It was about balance. about making sure that cruelty, even when wrapped in expensive suits and old money prestige, faced consequences. Tommy came downstairs, pajama-clad and sleepy-eyed. "Dad, is that Grandpa Rhett on TV again?" "Yeah, buddy, but you don't need to worry about it." "I know. Mom said he's going to prison for doing bad things." "That's right." Tommy climbed into Bradford's lap, something he'd been doing less and less as he got older. "Dad, I don't miss him. Grandpa Rhett. Is that bad?" Bradford held his son close. "No, Tommy. That's not bad at all. You miss the grandfather you wished you had, not the one you actually got. And that's okay. I like Grandpa Lionel better anyway." Lionel had become a regular fixture at their house, had stepped into the grandfather role with enthusiasm. "He doesn't care if I stutter. Nobody who matters cares if you stutter." "I know. My speech teacher says it's getting better." "It is. But even if it wasn't, you'd still be the smartest, bravest kid I know." Tommy smiled and snuggled closer. "Thanks, Dad. For making Grandpa Rhett face consequences." Bradford felt his throat tighten. "You're welcome, buddy. Nobody gets to hurt you. Not ever." Later that night, after Tommy was asleep and Krista had gone to bed, Bradford sat in his office and opened the file he'd been keeping for 10 years. Every slight, every insult, every moment of casual cruelty from Rhett Rhodes, all documented and cataloged. He deleted it, all of it, because he didn't need it anymore. The man who'd caused all that pain was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison, his reputation destroyed, his empire in ruins, his family scattered. Bradford had won, not because he'd gotten revenge, but because he'd gotten justice. And in the process, he'd taught his son the most important lesson he could, that strength wasn't about physical power or wealth or intimidation. It was about standing up for what was right, even when, especially when, it was hard. That night, Bradford slept better than he had in months. And when he woke up to Tommy's laughter drifting up from the kitchen, where Krista was making pancakes and the morning sun was streaming through the windows, he realized that this moment, this family, this peace was what he'd really been fighting for all along. Rhett Rhodes had tried to make them feel small. Instead, he'd given Bradford the chance to prove that family was built on love and protection, not fear and dominance. And in the end, that made all the difference. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.